For years she accepted living in the shadow, believing that love was more valuable than any fortune, and that a sincere heart was enough to sustain a marriage. But everything falls apart when her husband's betrayal reveals not just a devastating lie, but a humiliation so cruel that it transforms a dedicated wife into a force impossible to ignore. What seemed to be the silent end of an abandoned woman soon becomes the beginning of a return surrounded by power, mystery, and a reckoning capable of shaking influential people, destroying alliances, and exposing rotten ambitions. Between luxury, revenge, secrets hidden for 7 years, and a triumphal return that no one could foresee, this story shows how far someone can go after being betrayed in the most painful way. Now prepare yourself for an intense plot of fall, rebirth, and power, and subscribe to the channel now, so you don't miss any more surprising stories like this one. The garden of the house in Moema was small, but Renata treated it as if it were the largest in the world. She would wake up before the sun cracked the lead-colored sky of the avenue, take the ceramic watering can she had bought at a craft fair, and water each pot with an attention that bordered on a ritual. There was something almost religious in it, the repetition of gestures, the silence of the morning, the damp earth smelling like a beginning. It was there, among the begonias and the miniature cacti lined up on the kitchen window, that Renata felt the world still made sense. 7 years. That was how long she had been leading that life. 7 years living in a 3-room house on a dead-end street, buying fruit at the corner market, doing volunteer work at the neighborhood reading association every Tuesday, cooking without haste and going to bed early. To any neighbor looking from the sidewalk, Renata Meireles was exactly what she seemed, an ordinary woman with simple tastes, married to a man full of plans, and Henrique Castello had too many plans for such a small house. She had met him on an unlikely afternoon at a watercolor exhibition in Largo do Arouche. He had a degree in administration, worked at a medium-sized brokerage firm, and spoke about the financial market with the enthusiasm of someone who was certain he would one day dominate that universe. She had liked that. The ambition he didn't hide, the frankness with which he admitted wanting more. There was something refreshing about that man who didn't pretend to be content. At that time, Renata had spent years surrounded by people who only said what she wanted to hear, and Henrique's raw honesty seemed for a moment the most precious thing in the world. What she didn't tell him, not on that day nor on the following ones, nor in the months that built the courtship and the engagement and the simple civil ceremony on a rainy Monday in April, was who she really was. Renata Meireles was the name she had chosen for herself. Her true last name carried a weight she had decided consciously to leave folded in a locked drawer. Her mother had passed away when she was 18, her father 2 years later, and with them went the last illusion that money and power could protect someone from everything. What she inherited was not just a business conglomerate of incalculable value. She also inherited the loneliness of someone who doesn't know if they are loved for themselves or for what they represent. That's why she chose to disappear. With the help of an absolutely trusted lawyer and a shielded fund that silently managed the assets, she built a parallel life. A life without a driver, without an advisor, without security. A life with a ceramic watering can and a line at the market. And when Henrique Castello said he loved her, she believed it, because he had no way of knowing what he was loving besides her. In the first years it was good. He worked hard, came back tired, but there was an intimacy between them made of small things. The coffee he prepared on Saturday mornings, the discussions about series that kept them awake later than they should, the way he held her hand when they walked through the neighborhood. Renata convinced herself she had made the right choice, that it was possible to build love outside the context where she had been born. But São Paulo is not a city that lets ambition rest for long. With his promotion to junior partner at a Faria Lima investment boutique, Henrique came into contact with a world that began to consume everything he had. The clients were different. The lunches were different. The conversations changed tone, and along with them, the look he cast upon his own home. Renata noticed it first in the loose, almost careless words. "This fridge can't take it anymore. The car is embarrassing in a mall parking lot. Don't you ever think about taking a course, I don't know, something more relevant?" She answered with patience because she knew the pressure of that environment and believed it was a phase. The phase didn't pass. On an October night, he arrived late with his jacket loose and his eyes lit up by something that wasn't her. He sat at the table without taking off his shoes, looked around the kitchen as if he were seeing it for the first time, and said, almost to himself, that he needed a life worthy of what he was building. Renata asked what he meant by that. He said he meant exactly what he had said, and went to the bedroom without dinner. She remained sitting at the table with her plate still full, listening to the noise of the city outside, the barking of a distant dog, a horn, the slam of a car door, and felt for the first time that the choice she had made 7 years earlier was being put to the test in a way she hadn't foreseen. The next morning, Henrique woke up as if the previous night hadn't happened. He drank his usual coffee, gave her a quick kiss on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and left. Renata stood watching the cup he had left in the sink, still with coffee residue, and thought she should have washed it. But she didn't. She stared at it for a long time, trying to understand if what she felt was anguish or just fatigue. Later that same day, she went to the neighborhood reading association, helped organize a book donation, talked to Donna Sonia about the grandson who was going to college, drank hot coffee in a disposable cup, and returned home, walking slowly through the street fair that was set up every week in the square. She bought mangoes, curly lettuce, and a jar of honey she didn't need. She did it because she liked it, because that was hers, not what she had, but what she had chosen to be. And she still believed, on that sunny October afternoon, that the marriage could be saved, that Henrique was the man who had fallen in love with her in a watercolor gallery, and that the ambition growing in him hadn't yet devoured that part. She still believed that love was stronger than an address. She didn't know she was still wrong in the most expensive way possible. The first sign that Renata chose to ignore came at a celebration dinner for the investment boutique where Henrique worked. It was a Friday in November, and she had dressed with care, a sober dress, discreet earrings, her hair tied back with elegance, thinking the effort would be enough. When they arrived at the restaurant in Pinheiros, she immediately realized she had miscalculated. The women around the table wore jewelry worth triple anything she owned. The conversations revolved around renovations in apartments of over 300 square meters, trips to Tuscany, and brands she knew by name but had never frequented. Henrique circulated through the room as if he were finally in the place where he should have always been. And she, at his left, felt invisible in a new way. Not the invisibility she had chosen, that of voluntary anonymity, of the woman without a recognizable last name. It was the invisibility of someone who is not considered enough for the space they occupy. On the way back, he said nothing for almost 20 minutes. When he spoke, it was to comment that the senior partner of the office had arrived in an imported SUV with a private driver. She said it was nice. He said it was necessary. There was a huge difference, he added, between what was nice and what was necessary to be taken seriously in that environment. From then on, the comments became more frequent and sharper. He began to notice things he previously seemed not to see. The worn sofa in the living room, the kitchen faucet that had been dripping for weeks, her old cell phone model. Each observation came wrapped in a certain irony he had acquired without her being able to pinpoint exactly when. It wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was disdain. She tried to talk. One Sunday afternoon, while he was reading a report spread across the coffee table, she sat in front of him and said she wanted to understand what was happening between them. He lowered the report and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before. Not exactly irritation, but something close to impatience, as if her presence were background noise, interfering with his concentration. He said nothing was happening, that she was too sensitive, that there were situations in life where people needed to grow, and that it wasn't personal. Renata kept that word in her head for days. Grow. As if 7 years of marriage, of care, of choices made with intention were some kind of immaturity that needed to be overcome. She knew, better than anyone, what it meant to grow within a world where every detail has a price and every relationship has an intention. She had chosen to leave that exactly because growing, in the way that universe defined it, cost too much. But she said none of this. She got up, went to the kitchen, and started preparing lunch. The following months were a series of small capitulations she convinced herself were understanding. She stopped suggesting cheap outings in the neighborhood because he said he needed something different. She stopped inviting friends from the reading association because he treated them with a cold cordiality that made everyone uncomfortable. She stopped asking questions about work because the answers always made her feel she wasn't capable of understanding the universe he lived in. Henrique, for his part, came home later and later. Meetings at Faria Lima extended into dinners. Dinners turned into events into weekends where he would appear Saturday night with his jacket smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. She noticed and didn't ask, because something inside her knew the answer would be worse than the silence. It was on a Wednesday in March that the silence became unbearable. Henrique arrived home at 11 at night, threw his coat on a chair, and asked her not to wait for him at those hours because it was embarrassing to arrive and see the living room lit up as if it were a demand. She asked with a calmness that cost her dearly if he knew what he was saying. He said he knew very well, and then he added, like someone finally deciding to pull out a thorn, that he needed someone with resources, with connections, with a presence that matched what he was building. That she was a good person, but that good wasn't enough for what life demanded of him now. Renata listened to him without moving a muscle. When he finished, she said only that she was going to sleep, got up from the sofa, and went to the bedroom. She lay in bed in the dark, with her eyes open, and stayed that way for hours. She didn't cry. It wasn't sadness she felt, it was a kind of icy clarity, like when an anesthetic begins to work before surgery, and you know the pain will come later, but you can't feel it yet. What she didn't tell herself that night was that part of her had expected that moment. Not desired, expected. Like someone who knows the end of a story and yet returns to the previous pages, hoping that this time it will be different. She had bet that love was enough to hold a man who had never learned to want something without calculating the return. She had lost that bet. In the days that followed, Henrique treated the house like a hotel. He came in, went out, changed clothes, answered calls in English with the bedroom door closed. She continued watering the garden, going to the reading association, buying fruit at the fair. She maintained the routine because the routine was the only place where she still recognized herself. But there was one thing she had started to do discreetly at night, when the house was quiet. She would take her old cell phone and go to a number that wasn't saved in the contacts, the number of the only lawyer who knew who she really was. She didn't call yet. She just kept the number on the screen like someone holding a reserve card without knowing if they will need to play it. She didn't know yet that soon she would have no choice. The 7th wedding anniversary fell on a Tuesday. Renata knew this when she looked at the calendar on the fridge early on while waiting for the coffee to brew. She had written the date in red pen at the beginning of that year, as she did every year, with the conviction that dates like that deserved to be remembered. That morning she looked at the small heart drawn next to the numbers and stood in silence for a moment. Henrique didn't mention the date before leaving. She didn't expect him to. Even so, she decided she would make dinner, not out of illusion. The illusion had already left through the same door as the affection. She made dinner because she believed there was dignity in honoring what was real, even when what was real had already changed shape. She spent the morning choosing the menu and the afternoon in the kitchen, carefully reproducing the dish they had eaten on their first real dinner. Pasta al sugo with shredded meat, her mother's recipe, with the red wine he had chosen that night, and that she had kept in her memory as if it were a GPS coordinate for the beginning of love. She set the table with a white tablecloth she had kept for years. She lit 2 candles. She placed his chair on the side where he preferred to sit. She turned on some low music. She waited. He arrived at 10:30 at night. Renata was sitting on the sofa when she heard the key in the lock. Henrique entered with his eyes shining in an euphoria she recognized, not as shared joy, but as the agitation of someone who had just come from somewhere much better than their own home. He wore a suit she hadn't seen before, dark navy blue with a texture that suggested a high price, and he smelled of some 5-star hotel restaurant. He saw the table set. He saw the candles. He saw the covered plate she had left warming. For a second it seemed he was going to say something, perhaps remember, perhaps feel a flash of what once was. But the second passed. He threw his jacket on a chair, let out a sigh that held more impatience than fatigue, and pulled a white envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. He placed it on the table next to the candles and stepped back like someone completing a long overdue task. "Sign it this week," he said. "My lawyer prepared everything, simple division. You keep the house, the car too. You won't need much more with the way you live." Renata looked at the envelope. She looked at the candles. She looked at the untouched plate. "You are asking me for a divorce on our wedding anniversary," she said. It wasn't a question. "I prefer we call it a resolution," he replied, with the lightness of someone using an elegant euphemism learned in some corporate communication seminar. And then, as if the weight of the words were light enough to be tossed into the air, he added that he was with someone else, that he had met someone with whom he saw a real future, someone who matched what he was building, someone with substance. She asked who it was. He said the name without hesitating: Isabella Vasconcelos Drummond, the daughter of Roberto Drummond, founder of the Drummond Investment Group, one of the most powerful families in the Brazilian financial market. A woman whose name appeared in the social columns of business magazines, alongside astronomical figures. Renata heard that name and felt something click inside her with almost geometric precision. The universe sometimes has an absolutely merciless sense of humor. 7 years, she said softly. He looked at her with that expression of impatience she had already learned to decipher. 7 years of service rendered, he replied. You won't want for anything. The house is yours. Service rendered. She repeated the words in her head once, twice, 3 times. Not because she needed to process them. She processed them immediately, with a cold speed that surprised even herself. She repeated them because she wanted to record that moment with exactness, because she knew with a certainty that had been dormant for 7 years that those words were the fuse for something he would never see coming. Henrique went to the bedroom, packed a quick bag with what he needed for the next few days, and left without looking back. The door closed with a dry click. Renata remained sitting at the set table between the candles that were still burning, before the plate no one had touched. The music continued low in the background. The apartment smelled of tomato sauce and his perfume, which was already fading through the air conditioning. She blew out the candles. She sat in the dark for a moment. Then she got up, went to the sink, washed the plate without having touched the food, unfolded the white tablecloth, folded it carefully, and put it in the drawer. She turned off the living room lights. She entered the bedroom that had been theirs and sat on the edge of the bed. She took her cell phone. She opened her contacts. She scrolled to the nameless number that was saved only as a sequence of digits she had memorized a long time ago. She looked at the screen for exactly 3 minutes. Then she typed a single text message. Dr. Augusto, time to activate. She lay down. She closed her eyes. And for the first time in years she slept without dreams, because someone who has already made the most important decision of their life doesn't need to resolve anything in a dream. What would follow would not be revenge. It would simply be the truth finally tired of waiting. Dr. Augusto Leme had waited for that message for 7 years. He was the lawyer who had structured the entire asset protection scheme when Renata decided to disappear. A man in his 60s, with white hair, dark suits, and a way of speaking that eliminated unnecessary adjectives. He had been her father's lawyer before being hers, and he carried the secret with the same seriousness with which he carried every contract that passed through his hands. When the message arrived at 11:42 at night, he was awake. He always was. The next morning, when Renata opened the door of the house in Moma, there was a black car parked on the sidewalk with a driver in a suit she didn't know but who clearly knew her. In the back seat, Dr. Augusto was waiting with a folder on his knees and an expression that wasn't of surprise nor of urgency. It was of welcome. "Everything is ready," he said before she even sat down. "It always has been." The identity restoration process took less than 48 hours, not because it was simple, it was extraordinarily complex, but because it had been prepared in advance and kept updated in silence throughout all those years. The fund that managed the assets had continued to operate with surgical rigor, and the conglomerate her father had built and she had inherited was not only intact, but 3 times larger than when she had stepped away. The managers hired by Dr. Augusto had done the work she herself would have done had she been present. On Wednesday afternoon, Renata Meireles ceased to exist legally. In her place returned Renata Cavalcanti Orsini, sole heiress of the Orsini Group, a conglomerate with stakes in infrastructure, technology, renewable energy, real estate and asset management, headquartered in São Paulo and with operations in 12 countries. One of the most powerful figures in the Brazilian business world, whom the market had speculated about for years regarding her whereabouts and why she had disappeared. The answer, when it finally came, would make sense to no one and everyone at the same time. The first thing she did upon reassuming her identity was to ask Dr. Augusto to send Henrique's lawyer confirmation that the divorce papers would be signed without contest. No dispute, no negotiation. The house and the car, as he had proposed, would be left behind without any demands. She wanted nothing that belonged to that life. Henrique's lawyer took half an hour to respond. He clearly hadn't expected such a clean acceptance. Renata imagined the expression on her client's face when he found out. The second thing she did was rent, that same afternoon, an apartment in Itaim Bibi, a 400-square-meter penthouse that had belonged to a partner of the Orsini Group before being returned to the assets after a corporate buyback. The property was furnished with the discreet austerity she had always preferred. Light woods, clean lines, no ostentation, but with every detail chosen with care. She took only one small suitcase from the MoMA house. There was nothing there she needed to take. On Thursday morning, she presented herself to the executive board of the Orsini Group. The meeting had been called with less than 24 hours' notice, which was in itself a declaration of power. The 11 executives who entered the meeting room on that high floor of a glass tower on Faria Lima saw her sitting at the head of the table and stood in silence for a moment that lasted long enough for each one to understand what was happening. Renata greeted them with the direct cordiality of someone who doesn't need to make an impression. Because she wasn't trying to make an impression, she was simply coming home. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, she had established the general lines of a strategic reorganization that the board had suggested but postponed for lack of authority to approve. She approved it, with adjustments, and with a clarity of reasoning that left the CFO, a 50-year-old man with 20 years in the market, slightly quiet for a time that he would later call in a hallway conversation impressive. At night, she returned to the apartment in Itaim. She ordered sushi delivery, ate at the dining table looking at the city lights below, and thought, with a calm she had taken years to build, about Henrique Castello and everything he had said on the anniversary night. She felt no anger. Anger is an emotion that needs energy, and she had saved energy for more important things. What she felt was something closer to focus, a straight line forming between what had happened and what would come next, because Henrique had traded what he judged to be a worthless wife for a position of access to the Drummond Group. And the Drummond Group, she knew very well, had interests that crossed with those of the Orsini Group on at least 3 strategic fronts, interests over which she, now back, would have direct influence. It wasn't personal. It was just the market working as it always had. She opened her laptop, typed a message to the group's strategy director, and asked him to prepare a complete mapping of the operations involving the Drummond Group, directly or indirectly, over the next 15 days. No declared urgency, just information. She closed the laptop and went to sleep. Outside, São Paulo continued vibrating with the sordid energy of a city that never stops. Down there somewhere, Henrique Castello was celebrating what he believed to be his greatest move. He didn't know he had just moved a piece on a board whose rules were written by the one he had called a worthless woman. The game had restarted, and this time she was no longer playing from afar. The word the market used when the Orsini name began circulating again was resurgence. Financial columnists wrote with that mixture of caution and awe they reserve for rare events. Anonymous sources told specialized journalists that the heiress had returned with a clear agenda. No one knew exactly what that meant yet, but everyone knew it meant something. Renata didn't read any of those texts. She had more urgent things to do. The internal reorganization of the Orsini Group moved quickly because she had arrived with determination and diagnostic clarity. In the first 10 days, she spoke with each area director individually, listened more than she spoke, and formed a mental map of the inefficiencies the board had allowed to accumulate for lack of someone with authority to cut them. Some were structural, processes that had been designed for a smaller company and never updated. Others were human, people in the wrong place out of loyalty or inertia. She treated both with the same pragmatism she had learned to develop in a school that had no classroom. The area that interested her most was strategic investments. There lay the point of contact with Henrique's universe. The Orsini Group had among its positions a minority stake in an infrastructure holding company that had signed 2 years earlier an operational partnership with a fund managed by the Drummond Group. The partnership was technically valid, but it had been structured in conditions that favored Drummond disproportionately, an imbalance that previous managers had accepted for reasons the strategy director preferred to call, diplomatically, decisions of the transition period. Renata called them what they were: carelessness. She asked the legal team to prepare a complete contract review, not to break the partnership immediately, that would be noisy and costly before its time, but to document every clause, every performance indicator, every unfulfilled obligation. It was a months-long job that she compressed into 3 weeks, personally reviewing the documents at night after the office emptied. There was nothing illegal in what the Drummond Group had done. There was only a skillful exploitation of a distracted partner. And a partner who returns from distraction tends to renegotiate with other arguments. Meanwhile, Henrique Castello was living the best phase of his own narrative. He had secured, through his relationship with Isabella Drummond, a position as a special advisor to the fund the family controlled. It wasn't a formal position. It was one of those behind-the-scenes arrangements that work as long as personal relationships work. But for him, it was confirmation that he had bet correctly. The life he had imagined while looking with disdain at the fridge in the Moema house was finally within reach. He started appearing at events, being photographed alongside Roberto Drummond at dinners of the São Paulo High Society, having his name cited in columns that previously would never have mentioned him. He was, in his own perception, arriving. He didn't know he was arriving at exactly the point where someone had prepared the ground to receive him. Renata's team concluded the mapping of the Drummond Group with a precision that surprised even the most experienced analysts. The report, delivered on a Friday afternoon, was 123 pages long and revealed a management pattern that relied heavily on asymmetric partnerships to compensate for a capital structure that was more fragile than the family's reputation suggested. Drummond was powerful, but its solidity was more narrative than numerical. Renata read the entire report over the weekend. The following Monday, she called a restricted meeting with the strategy director and the CFO. She presented to them, in precise terms and without drama, the opportunity the situation opened up. It wasn't necessary to attack. It was only necessary to renegotiate, reposition, and let the natural consequences of an unbalanced structure do the work. The CFO asked if there was any personal reason in that decision. She looked at him with the serenity of someone who has learned not to confuse emotion with strategy. "There is a structural reason," she said. "The Orsini Group does not maintain unbalanced partnerships. It never has." The meeting ended with an action plan divided into 4 phases over 6 months. Each phase had objective evaluation criteria. Each decision had documentary justification. There was nothing in that plan that a court could question, because there was nothing in that plan that needed to be questioned. It was just business. One afternoon that week, while crossing the tower lobby with her folder under her arm and her cell phone in her hand, she stopped before a large mirror that had been installed at the building's entrance, an architectural detail she had always found unnecessary, but which at that moment served an involuntary purpose. She looked at the woman she saw there. Hair done, charcoal grey suit, the posture of someone who knows what they are doing. She wasn't different from the woman who had watered begonias in a house in Moma. She was the same, with different layers appearing on the surface. No one had created her. She had created herself twice. She left the building into the afternoon sun on Faria Lima and asked the driver to take her to Itaim by the longest route, passing through Largo do Arouche. She wanted to see how the place where it all began was doing. It was the same. The city aged in everything except memories. The invitation arrived by email on a Thursday afternoon, the annual Investment and Innovation Forum held at the Grande Hotel São Paulo in the city's historic center. It was one of the most anticipated events on the São Paulo corporate calendar, 2 nights of lectures, dinners, and behind-the-scenes meetings that were worth as much as any formal negotiation. Renata had participated in previous editions alongside her father, while still young, learning to read the environment before learning to navigate it. She had been absent for 7 years. She confirmed her attendance. The news that Renata Cavalcanti Orsini would be at the event circulated before she arrived. This was inevitable. Her return to the market had generated discreet but consistent attention in recent weeks, and the forum was exactly the kind of stage where presence means declaration. People who had worked with her father sought out Dr. Augusto to confirm. Specialized journalists adjusted their schedules. The event organizer himself contacted her to ask if she would accept a seat at the main table for Saturday's dinner. She accepted. The main table was fine. On Saturday night, she arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, neither too early, which would suggest anxiety, nor late, which would suggest posturing. She wore a precisely cut black dress she had chosen personally, without an assistant or a style consultant. The only adornment was a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to her mother. Simple, but of a quality that those who understood recognized without needing an explanation. The room was one of those that try to communicate power through proportion. High ceilings, chandeliers disguised as contemporary installations, tables dressed in white with arrangements that were the work of someone very well paid to look natural. There were at least 300 people there, what the circles called who's who, with all their contradictions and invisible hierarchies. She entered, greeted the organizer, accepted a glass of sparkling water, and began to circulate. She saw Henrique before he saw her. He was on the other side of the room, alongside Roberto Drummond and Isabella, in a group of 6 or 7 people who were laughing at something with that calculated nonchalance of environments where no one truly laughs. Henrique wore a new dark suit, his hair slightly shorter, and there was in him the posture of someone who had spent months practicing how to look like they had always belonged to that place. Renata watched for a few seconds without moving. There was no anger in what she felt. There was something closer to clinical curiosity. That man had spent 7 years by her side without knowing who she was. And now he was in that room believing he had finally reached the top, without knowing that the top had a face, a name, and a presence that very night. She turned her back on the group and went to greet the president of a bank who had done business with her father decades earlier. He was the one who mentioned it first. "I heard that Orsini is going to renegotiate the partnership with Drummond. Roberto is going to hate that." She smiled with the lightness of someone who neither confirms nor denies. Roberto is intelligent enough to understand when a renegotiation makes sense for both sides. The banker looked at her with respect, mixed with something like amusement. "You were away for a long time, Renata, but you haven't lost a thing." She thanked him and moved on. Dinner began at 9. She was sitting at the main table, between the State Infrastructure Secretary and an investor from Singapore who was participating in the forum for the 3rd time. The conversation was intelligent, direct, and flowed with the naturalness of exchanges between people who don't need to pretend. It was during the second course that she felt the weight of a gaze. She looked up and found Henrique on the other side of the room, motionless among the waiters circulating with trays. He looked at her with an expression she took a moment to identify. It wasn't surprise. It was collapse. The kind of silent collapse that happens when reality reformats everything a person believed to be true. Beside him, Isabella Drummond had followed her boyfriend's gaze. And then, with the speed of someone making connections in real time, she also stopped. Renata held Henrique's gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she returned to the conversation with the investor from Singapore as if nothing had happened. Because, for her, in fact, nothing had happened, only confirmation of what she already knew. What happened next was a domino effect she hadn't orchestrated, but had anticipated with reasonable precision. Roberto Drummond, upon being discreetly informed by an advisor of who the woman sitting at the main table was, processed the information with decades of market experience. In seconds, he understood what the renegotiation that had arrived at his office the previous week really meant. And he also understood what the young special advisor he had brought close to him had unintentionally set in motion. Roberto was a man who had survived the market precisely because he never confused personal relationships with strategic positioning. What he saw that night was an imbalance he himself had committed. Henrique, on the other hand, turned pale. Isabella Drummond stood up from the table with a social smile glued to her face and went to the bathroom. She took 15 minutes to return. When she came back, there was something different in the way she looked at her boyfriend, the coldness of a person who has just recalculated an equation and didn't like the result. Renata left before the end of the dinner. Not because she had finished her work, because she had done enough for that night. Her presence had already said more than any speech. In the car, as São Paulo passed by through the dark windows, she remained in silence. The driver didn't ask anything, he never did. She thought of the last time she had left an event in that city, feeling she had lost something. It had been the night she decided to step out of her own name and live another way, 7 years ago. Now, on the other side of that arc, she had returned to the starting point with everything she had taken, plus everything she had built. It wasn't a victory, it was simply the world returning to its axis. What followed the forum was not an attack. It was a natural sequence of events that Renata had set in motion with the patience of someone who plants before harvesting. The renegotiation of the partnership between the Orsini Group and the holding company associated with the Drummond Group was formalized in a 40-page document that the legal team had prepared with surgical precision. The new clauses rebalanced the distribution of results, redefined performance indicators, and included an independent auditing mechanism that Drummond had never accepted in previous contracts. Roberto Drummond received the proposal on a Monday morning and returned it signed on Wednesday. That in itself was the most silent and clearest declaration of the event. When Roberto signed, it was because he had calculated that renegotiating with Orsini was smarter than resisting, and because he had understood that night at the forum that the young advisor he had brought into his personal circle carried with him a complication he hadn't foreseen. Henrique Castello had been a bet that seemed promising and had revealed itself to be a liability. The news that Henrique's position had been undone, a technical term for a dismissal that couldn't be called a dismissal because it had never been a formal job, reached Renata not because she had asked, but because Dr. Augusto, who was discreetly monitoring the scenario, informed her in a brief call on a Wednesday afternoon. She listened and said only, "Understood." But the story hadn't ended there. Henrique was not the type of man who accepts the reversal of a narrative without trying to rewrite it. In the following days, rumors began to circulate about the Orsini Group, not in the serious, specialized press, but in those gossip columns that live on unconfirmed versions and insinuations, with anonymous quotes. The stories were vague but strategic, suggestions that Renata's return had been motivated by obscure interests, that there were irregularities in the fund's management during the years of absence, that Dr. Augusto himself had acted outside the limits his mandate allowed. None of it was true. But a lie doesn't need to be true to cause damage. It only needs distribution. Renata identified the source in 48 hours. It wasn't hard. There were only a limited number of people with the motivation and enough access to partial information to build that kind of narrative. The pattern of inaccuracies, correct on the surface, wrong on technical details, indicated someone who had overheard conversations without fully understanding them. She chose not to respond directly. She chose to respond in the only way that leaves no room for a rebuttal, with evidence. She opened the Orsini Group to a voluntary audit, conducted by one of the 4 largest auditing firms in the world. The decision was communicated via a press release in a dry and precise format. The group, in celebration of the president's return, opted for a complete and public review of its operations over the last 10 years as a commitment to transparency with the market. No reference to the rumors, no defensive tone. Only the declaration of someone who has nothing to hide and wants everyone to know it. The effect was immediate. The rumors lost fuel before gaining traction. The columnists who had reproduced the insinuations went silent, as they do when they realize they were on the wrong side of a move they hadn't understood. But it was the following week that brought the most significant moment. In a live interview on an economy program on a major network, a journalist asked Renata directly about the story of the marriage and the hidden identity. Information that had finally reached the major media after weeks of circulating behind the scenes. It was the question she knew would come. Renata was sitting in the studio with the exact posture of someone who had prepared every syllable of the answer. She spoke for 4 minutes without being interrupted. She said she had chosen, in a phase of life marked by deep personal losses, to live outside the context where she was born, because she had believed that genuine love was possible outside of any last name. She said she had discovered, in the most expensive way, that there were people incapable of loving, beyond what a relationship can offer in terms of position and resource. And she said, with a calmness that made the studio go silent, that she carried no resentment, only a clearer understanding of how the world works and the responsibility to use what she possesses with purpose. She didn't mention Henrique by name. She didn't need to. He was at home when the program aired. He saw the interview. He sent Dr. Augusto that same night a message that the lawyer passed on to Renata without comment. It was a request for a conversation. She replied that there was nothing to talk about that couldn't be handled by their respective lawyers. Isabella Drummond, for her part, had distanced herself from Henrique the week before, with the pragmatism of someone who discovers that a personal bet has compromised an important professional relationship. There was no drama. There was simply the absence that settles in when two people reach the end of their mutual utility. Henrique had bet everything on an ascent that depended on a relationship, that depended on a position, that depended on a trust that had disintegrated. He was, in the most precise sense of the expression, exactly where he had placed himself. Renata didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. There were only consequences, and consequences don't ask for permission or choose an hour. She closed her laptop that night, went to the balcony of the apartment in Itaim and looked at the city. She thought of the 7 years in Moema, the garden, the begonias on the kitchen window. She thought of Donna Sonia from the Reading Association, who knew nothing about what had happened and probably never would. She thought of the jar of honey she had bought without needing it at the Square's street fair on an afternoon that seemed much more distant than it was. There was a part of all that she didn't want to lose, but she would discover in the following days that losing wasn't even the right word. There was a question Renata had avoided for weeks. What comes after the war? Not because she was afraid of the answer, but because wars have a property of filling all available space while they last, and when they end, they leave a silence that needs to be inhabited by something new. She had returned to power with clarity and focus. She had repositioned the group, balanced the partnerships, responded to the rumors, closed the chapters that needed to be closed, and then, on a Thursday afternoon with no urgent meetings, and with the office slightly quieter than usual, she sat at her desk and realized there was no urgency pulling her thoughts in any direction. It was the first time in months that this had happened. She sat there for a while. She looked out the window at the city. She saw a pigeon perched on the edge of another building, preening its feathers with that comic seriousness pigeons have. She thought, for no specific reason, of the Moma garden. That week, she called Donna Sonia. The lady answered with her usual voice, a bit raspy, full of energy, always in the middle of something. It took her a moment to identify who it was. When she did, the silence on the other end lasted exactly as long as necessary for the emotion to pass. "You vanished without explanation," said Donna Sonia. "I know," said Renata. "I needed to resolve some things." "Resolve everything?" "Almost everything." Donna Sonia made a sound of approval and asked if she still read. Renata said she always did. The lady said a huge book donation had arrived and she was in need of arms to organize it. Renata said she would show up. She showed up the following Saturday. She didn't go as Renata Cavalcanti Orsini, with a driver and a suit. She went in jeans and white sneakers and a bag with cheese bread she had bought at the neighborhood bakery. She spent 3 hours helping to catalogue the books by category, talking to the volunteers, listening to Donna Sonia talk about the new projects she wanted to implement. When someone asked where she had disappeared to, she said she had been resolving personal issues and that she was back. No one asked anything else. It was the most honest thing she could have said. In that period, she also began to wonder what she had learned from the 7 years of simple life that was truly hers. Not strategy, not positioning, not power. What she had learned that would remain when everything else was removed. The answer that arrived slowly over weeks was not a list. It was more like an image, the coffee cup Henrique had left in the sink without washing, which she had stood looking at while he walked out the door for the last time before everything changed. In that moment, she had felt the fragility of having bet her own happiness on another person's capacity to see what really mattered. She had learned at a high cost that the version of herself that hid her last name was no more authentic than the one that carried it. Both were her. The mistake hadn't been hiding the money. It had been believing that love would be immune to what she hid. True love wouldn't be less love for knowing the truth, and what wasn't true didn't deserve to be protected by any sacrifice. It was a lesson she kept without converting it into a general rule, because she knew each person learns by the path they have available. At the Orsini Group, she began implementing changes that weren't just strategic. She created an internal leadership development program that prioritized professionals with non-linear trajectories, people who had arrived from unlikely places, who had learned in alternative circuits, who understood the world from angles that traditional circuits didn't reach. The program wasn't announced with fanfare. It was simply instituted, and it began to work. She hired as innovation director a 42-year-old engineer who had worked for 15 years in medium-sized municipalities developing infrastructure solutions with a minimal budget. The board found it unusual. She said that was exactly why it was perfect. She went back to attending exhibitions. Not the social openings with cocktails and photographers, but those open to the public on Saturday afternoons, where the silence before a canvas was complete and no one knew or wanted to know who was who. She bought a small painting by a young artist exhibiting for the first time a watercolor of a neighborhood street with rain settled on the sidewalk. She placed it in the E-Time apartment on the dining room wall, where she saw it every day. She didn't think of Henrique often. When she did, it was with the distance of someone revisiting a closed chapter, not with longing, not with bitterness, but with the silent recognition that what had happened had been necessary to get where she was. There was one night on a rainy Friday when she called Dr. Augusto just to ask how he was. There was no pending legal matter. He was silent for a moment that said more than any answer, and then he spoke for 20 minutes about the renovation he was doing on a farm he owned in the countryside. She listened the whole time. When she hung up, she stood looking at the watercolor of the rainy street on the wall. There was, in that woman sitting in the E-Time apartment, something that wasn't there when she had entered Dr. Augusto's car weeks earlier. It wasn't exactly satisfaction. Satisfaction is an emotion that exhausts itself. It was closer to integrity. The feeling that the different versions of herself had finally recognized each other, without one having to erase the other to exist. The woman who watered begonias in MoMA and the commander of the Orsini Group were the same person, and that person, for the first time in a long time, didn't need to hide anything from anyone. Not because the world was safer, but because she had learned, in the definitive way that only great losses teach, that the only disguise not worth wearing is that of yourself. São Paulo continued out there, vibrant and indifferent and magnificent as always, and she, inside herself, was finally back. 2 years later, the Orsini name had returned to occupy the place it should have always held on the map of the Brazilian business world. The group had grown 38% since Renata's return, not by a single aggressive move, but by the sum of consistent decisions made by someone who had learned to distinguish what lasts from what shines. The partnership with the Drummond Group had been renegotiated twice and now worked with the balance that both sides recognized as fair. Roberto Drummond, in a conversation at an event in Brasilia, had told a third party, who eventually reported back to Renata, that she was the best adversary the market had produced in the last 20 years. She had received the comment with the smile of someone who doesn't need approval but recognizes an honest compliment. Of Henrique, there wasn't much to report. He had opened a small consultancy, resumed contacts he had neglected during his phase of maximum ambition, and lived, from what was known, a life that was exactly to the measure of what he had discarded as insufficient. If there was any irony in that, it wasn't personal. The MoMA Reading Association had received an anonymous donation that tripled its space and allowed for the hiring of 2 full-time educators. Donna Sonia knew who it came from, because Donna Sonia knew everything. She said nothing more than, "It was about time," which was exactly the right answer. Renata continued showing up on Saturdays, when her schedule allowed, not always in jeans and cheese bread, sometimes in her office suit after a long morning, but she showed up. There was in that unlikely balance between the meeting room and the used bookshelf something she had taken longer than she would have liked to understand. That power, when well used, is not the opposite of simplicity. It is a responsibility that can be exercised with lightness or with weight, depending on who carries it. She had decided to carry it with lightness. And as for that ceramic watering can, she had bought at a craft fair 10 years ago. It was still with her. On the balcony of the Italian apartment, along with 3 pots of begonias and a miniature cactus she had received as a gift from a co-worker who didn't even know the whole story. Every morning before the meetings and reports and decisions that move markets, she took the watering can and watered each pot with an attention that bordered on a ritual. There was something almost religious in it. The repetition of gestures, the silence of the morning, the damp earth smelling like a beginning. Some things do not need to change for everything else to change completely. End of story. And you who followed every step of this journey know that stories like Renata's exist because there are people willing to listen to them until the end. If this narrative touched something in you, leave your like. It is the simplest gesture to say that it is worth continuing. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of other lives that insist on being greater than their circumstances. And in the comments tell us, what moment of the story will you not forget? We are here every week with new stories that begin where the easy explanations end.